In this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of reciprocity. Reciprocity is a concept central to notions of justice, notions of social justice, and notions of political authority and political obligation. So what is reciprocity? Reciprocity is simply the moral obligation to return favors. Now, I agree, in the literature, in sociology, and anthropology, reciprocity is also the tendency, or the observed tendency, of people to actually return favors. But given this is political theory, what we're looking for is an obligation, that is to say, a requirement, regardless of whether you want to discharge it or not. What is a favor? Well, a favor is a couple different things. It's a benefit that you receive that no one was obligated to provide for you. So, for example, when you go buy a pastry at the local bakery and you give them the money and they give you the pastry, they're not doing you a favor by giving you the pastry. They had to give you the pastry. They themselves are already discharging an obligation that they incurred when you gave them money. And when you gave them money, you didn't do them a favor. You gave them the money precisely in order to get the pastry. So in that kind of commercial interaction, there's no reciprocity at all unless someone in the transaction is giving away more than was needed. So the benefactor has to provide you with a benefit that they were not obligated to provide for you. A second part of this concept of reciprocity is the benefactor has to provide the benefit for you mainly for non-selfish reasons. So it's not a favor if the person is really just benefiting themselves more than they are benefiting you. So if they're benefiting themselves through benefiting you, there's a sense in which you haven't received a favor at all, or at least the person has not done you a favor, even if you have received a benefit. Now, I don't believe that self-interest necessarily destroys the idea of giving favors. A person may give benefits to others for multiple reasons, but at some point, if the motivations that they had when they gave you the favor was too self-interested, it no longer looks like a favor. So, as we saw with Socrates, when others confer benefits upon us, there seems to be a presumption that an obligation now exists that did not exist before. An account, you might say, is out of balance, and it's up to us to even the score. Particularly for the sort of person who believes that a good person pays his or her debts. Socrates would say a just person gives others their due. Then we want to be the sorts of persons who return favors, because when we've received a favor, we understand that an account is out of balance, and we need to do something to rectify that. Furthermore, we also recognize that as a matter of social practice, those who don't return favors do not receive favors when needed. That is to say that a society or a person, well, let's put it this way, a society where people don't return favors is a society where few favors will probably be given, and a person who fails to return favors is not a person who will be receiving a whole lot of favors in the future. So in that sense, the notion of reciprocity seems to be central to the enterprise of social cooperation. It's part of what it means to be engaged in a society that you acquire obligations to return favors. Now, there are in fact two types of reciprocity, and this is something that Schmidtz points out quite nicely. There's symmetrical reciprocity and transitive reciprocity. Now, symmetrical reciprocity is simply what people owe their benefactors. So when someone benefits you, you owe them duties of symmetrical reciprocity. But there's going to be cases where paying back favors is not possible or appropriate. In that case, we can settle the debt in a different sort of way. We can pass on the favors to others. These days we would say we pay it forward or pass it forward. So for instance, when an athlete graduates from a Division I program in sports, say in football, and goes pro, certainly the athlete can pay back the favors received from their alma mater by, for instance, donating back to their university in gratitude But there's another thing that they can do is try to provide scholarships for other similarly situated athletes at their university or other universities. In that sense, instead of paying back their benefactors, they pay it forwards. They pay it to other people who, like them, are gifted but do not have the opportunity to play in Division I sports, and they try to give them that opportunity. In that sense, they are paying it forward. So two types of reciprocity, symmetrical and transitive, and it's not always the case that we have to pay our benefactors back. Sometimes the appropriate thing to do is to pay it forward. There's also, in addition to forwards and backwards sort of reciprocity, that is to say, symmetric and transitive, there's another two ways of understanding reciprocity. One is constraint, and the other is a value. Now, reciprocity as a constraint simply means that the way we understand the function of reciprocity in a moral theory is as a constraint on what we do, as an obligation, as a requirement. So, for instance, if we acquire a favor, reciprocity is, if we are the beneficiaries of a favor, reciprocity as constraint says justice will be served when you repay the favor that you received. A slightly different way of looking at reciprocity is as a value. For instance, we could say that we can assess societies based on whether those societies are places where reciprocity occurs or places that foster reciprocity. Are societies places that put people, or are there opportunities in societies for people to return favors? Do societies enable people to contribute to each other's lives by extending and returning favors? Here we would not merely look at individuals and say pay back the favor, but we would look at the society as a whole and say, is this the sort of place where people pay their debts? Is this the sort of place where people return favors? Right? So we all know that we should pay our debts, but it's worth noting that some of us have more debts than others, and sometimes through no fault of our own. And of course, some of us also have greater capacity to repay debts, again, blamelessly through no fault of our own. And treating reciprocity only as a constraint, and this is Schmitz's worry, can really constrain some people. And worse, because some of us are unable to contribute, for instance, the severely handicapped, reciprocity as a constraint suggests that those people who are very constrained are, in some sense, morally deficient. That is to say that the handicapped are more morally deficient than the rest of us because they acquire a whole lot of debts and they have a hard time to repay them. Now, if the point of justice is to enable us to live good lives, reciprocity as a constraint seems to leave something to be desired. It suggests that the weak, the disabled, and the otherwise unfortunate are going to be less just in some ways, are going to be in some ways less worthy than those who are fortunate. And this rubs a lot of people the wrong way. So if we look at reciprocity instead as a value, reciprocity no longer seems to become the sort of thing that condemns the most vulnerable in society. If we look at reciprocity as a value, then we could see the point of societies as in part to be putting people in positions where they can be responsible contributors to exchanges, including the exchanges of favors. And so, on this view, reciprocity doesn't condemn the disabled for their inability to reciprocate, but reciprocity plays a very different role in our theories of justice. Reciprocity commands us to figure out how to help the disabled and everyone else to become better contributors and better reciprocators. So, for example, on the view of reciprocity as value, reciprocity would require us to support research into assistive technologies, wheelchairs and prosthetics and braille and audiobooks and eye tracing software and all the kinds of technologies that help people who are constrained become better contributors and better reciprocators. Also, we would imagine that reciprocity as value provides an incentive to support the kinds of economic programs that enable people to stand on their own 2 feet, whatever those economic programs are. So in that sense, when we think of helping people, reciprocity says we should think about helping them also to become more independent and capable of reciprocating, because ultimately our societies, on this view, are judged based on how frequently and how well its members are able to reciprocate. So Schmitz's view is the latter view, right? The view of that reciprocity should be treated also as a value. Societies where people have incentives to return favors and also extend favors are good places to live. Societies that foster exchanges also create enough wealth and innovation that the disabled often don't need to be carried as much, and the profoundly disabled can in fact be carried without imposing a massive burden on others. Now, Schmidtz understands that morality requires us to worry about those who need to be carried in life: children, the disabled, the very elderly, the poor. The value of reciprocity suggests a particular way of meeting our obligations by trying to help people become contributors and reciprocators, not by making them dependent on the generosity and charity of others, but by trying to enable them. And it also suggests that our motivation for helping the needy need not always be a concern for the needy, but a concern for justice, a shared concern with living in a society that fosters mutually beneficial exchanges rather than a society that creates large classes of dependent peoples who ultimately can never settle their debts, if you will, even the score. And that's something that even the moral egoist can recognize. The moral egoist can certainly recognize the value and superiority of societies where people reciprocate and are capable of contributing, even if the egoist has no sympathy for the needy. That is to say, the egoist can recognize that he is better off in a society where people reciprocate rather than in a society where he, along with many others, run the risk of becoming a dependent class. Now, in addition to playing that role in justice and social justice, reciprocity also plays a role in theories of authority. Some theorists in particular resist the notion that society is a voluntary enterprise. What they're doing is resisting the notion that your consent is needed before political authority can be imposed upon you. They might concede that we are born free, that is to say that nobody is born under obligations to anyone at the time of their birth, but as soon as people start breathing, they receive favors from other people, including the government. That is to say, as soon as we start living, and indeed for a long time in our childhood, we are in a state of abject dependency on others, and therefore we are receiving favors from others that can only be repaid through reciprocity, including good behavior, taxes, and political loyalty. Now, I should say that we're receiving benefits. Whether we're receiving favors is something we'll examine in a later lecture. But in any case, theorists of reciprocity say that we are engaged in an intergenerational cooperative enterprise that involves an exchange of favors, actually continual exchanges of favors, goods, and services, both symmetrical and transitive. If you think that all your rights and duties can be specified in advance through some sort of contract, social contract or otherwise, you're kind of misunderstanding what it means to live in a political community, these theorists say. It's an open-ended commitment, one that you don't join through consent. That is to say, you don't consent to be born, and you don't consent to be in any state of dependency throughout the early part of your life, and indeed throughout most of your life. You are engaged in a network, a web of favors that perhaps you will always be, in some sense, indebted to. Okay, so these theorists look at the refusal of some people, like philosophical anarchists like Simmons, look at the refusal of political obligation after receiving favors, and say this really smacks of ingratitude, right? It's not just wrong; it's a character failing. That is to say, you're not just refusing to do your part in a cooperative enterprise, but you're also a bad person for refusing to acknowledge these obligations. You're a bad citizen. You're someone who's not really worthy of political association. Okay, so now that we've looked at reciprocity's role both in justice and in authority, we'll proceed in the next lecture to problems of political problems with reciprocity, and in particular problems with grounding accounts of political authority in accounts of reciprocity.